This video provides a comprehensive overview of the new features and tools in version 1.12. It focuses specifically on what's new in this version only, rather than covering all there is to machine tools, which includes a wide range of tools and menus to streamline your Blender workflow, at least if you activate them all. So let's dive into the latest additions in version 1.12, the 36th feature update since its initial release 7 years ago, by the way. This update is also the first paid update now, as my revenue unfortunately continues to decline, and so I can no longer invest the time I used to spend on developing these add-ons if it doesn't pay my bills anymore, hence why free feature updates are history. For now. For what it's worth, I've spent over 2 months full-time, 7 days a week on this update alone. Asset creation now works even from objects that are what I call severely hidden, which describes objects in either excluded or hidden collections. You don't have to do anything for this. Machine tools will simply find them and will then do the heavy lifting, whereas previously these objects may have been ignored. And there you go, an army of avocado bots. In previous releases, when you created an asset, you would lose your decal backups or mesh machine stashes. This was an intentional design decision at the time to simplify the asset creation process. However, in this version, you now have the option to keep or discard them. If you keep them, they will persist even after disassembly, so you can always get them back if needed. When you create an assembly asset with machine tools, it duplicates all the individual objects making up the assembly. Now you can also work with the original objects instead, which might suit your workflow better, though it's a bit more limited and, in my view, less suitable for complex assemblies. Once enabled in the add-on prefs, you'll have the option to disable duplication in the assembly creation pop-up now. I usually advise against that, but it's your choice. So let's create an asset using the original objects now. If you move parts of the original, you'll see the assembly update too accordingly, and this is true for all instances of it. Now, if you want to continue working on the originals, be aware that changes relating to new objects will not be reflected in the assemblies unless they are made part of the assembly collection. You can drag it in, linking it, and then the new object appears within the assembly instances too. So it's important to understand that assemblies always only represent what's linked to their specific instance collection. Assembly creation in machine tools works across the entire hierarchy of an asset. For example, this object is parented to several empties, one after the other. During assembly creation, machine tools moves up and down the hierarchy from your selection, selecting everything. So even if you initially select only one object, the asset might consist of many more, almost 600 objects in this case. That does include many stash objects, however. You can see that even though only one object was selected, an entire assembly was created despite it, and that is done intentionally to simplify the process. Now, if you want to create an assembly asset from just the middle section of this finger here perhaps, you would still create an assembly of the entire hand in previous versions, because the entire hierarchy would be included. As of this version, however, you can opt to create it for the selection only. It will still collect related objects in children, which helps you with decals and subsets, so that you don't need to select every single object yourself. But it won't select further up or down the group hierarchy in this mode. This results in, let's call it a sub-assembly asset. And here it is now. An asset for just the subsection of the finger. Let's go ahead and create an isolated thumbnail for it too while at it. In Machine Tools 1.12, when you create an asset, you can still set the name and catalog as before. In addition, you can now also set tags and fill in metadata, or leave it empty until later maybe. Since metadata doesn't change much from one asset to the next, you set it up in the add-on preferences. For example, I've filled in the author, but you can also add copyright and unlicense. I now just create the asset, add a bunch of tags. Make sure the metadata toggle is enabled, and then confirm. You'll see in the asset browser that the tags and metadata have been assigned to the asset now. Had you filled in license and copyright, then these two would show up here, of course. Tags will also be visible here, can be updated at any point, and you'll now be able to find your assets by searching for them. Thumbnail generation is based on the bounding box of an object, but that bounding box can sometimes be too big. Why is that? It happens because Blender thinks that the object's dimensions are different than what you see in the viewport, and is usually related to objects using mirror modifiers, in particular in combination with rotated objects. This causes the bounding box to appear bigger in world space. And so, if you create a thumbnail from that, it won't be framed very well, showing a lot of space around the asset itself. One way to work around that is to create the thumbnail not from the assembly assets empty, but maybe from a selection of the original objects, maybe a single one even. It works well, but sometimes it might be too close, which would be just as undesirable. In Deus Ex, you now have full control over the thumbnail framing by using the thumbnail helper gizmo to frame the asset. When first invoked, it too will be based on the bounding box, and so may also be too big. But you can drag it smaller and focus on exactly what you want. With the helper gizmo active, creating a new thumbnail will then reference the gizmo instead of the bounding box. Now, if you then change the view, be aware that the helper gizmo is no longer aligned to the view. You can then either toggle the gizmo off and on, or you simply control-click the Render Thumbnail button to realign the gizmo with the view. Once finished, simply disable the gizmo again, and you are all set. All of these objects are assemblies, right? So single objects that each reference a collection of objects. And they were brought in from outside from my asset library. Previously, the only way to access these would be to disassemble, which will essentially destroy the assembly but reveal the individual objects, and with that give you access to the object's modifiers or materials, for instance. Now in Deus Ex, you can edit the assembly directly from the Modes Pie or the sidebar's Asset Browser Tools section. This brings you into a dedicated Edit Assembly scene, which you'll notice by the red border around the 3D view, in the red button up here, and also in the sidebar, and again in the Modes Pie too. And here, you can make changes to the individual objects of the assembly. And once you exit this Assembly Edit mode, the changes are reflected externally. What's interesting maybe is that the view persists relative to the assembly, even though the object is rotated on the outside, but the assembly objects within the collection are not. Additionally, the cursor persists too. Notice how it is aligned and located in relation to the world origin within the assembly edit scene. For instance, I now align the cursor to this object here. Then when I finish the assembly edit, both the view and the cursor remain perfectly positioned and oriented relative to the assembly. This can be tremendously useful, and I'll show it later. Finally, let's bring in a linked assembly. I follow up by making the object local, but not its data, so not its instance collection in this case. This allows me to move the object, while everything that makes up the object remains in an external library file. In the Modes Pie, you can tell that an assembly is linked because the Edit button is red now. It's the same in the sidebar too, red labels and a red collection field. You can still go into assembly edit mode despite this, but can't make any changes until you make the collection local. It can be useful to just peek inside to see what's going on. And now that I made the assembly contents local too, I can just edit everything as usual. In the past, if you had an assembly and wanted to change its origin, you'd have to do it based on the original object's location. You can still do this, but now it requires a Shift Mod key. A more convenient way, I think, is to just do it relative to the assembly empty itself. This is now the default behavior, and of course, you can toggle it here in the Redo panel too. If you take a look inside the assembly now, you'll find that the objects still sit at their world origin as before. Only the offset of the empties instance collection has actually changed so far. And what you can now do is reset that offset. And while it seems like nothing has changed from the outside, on the inside the assembly objects have been moved in a way that perfectly compensates for the zeroing out of the instance collection's offset. Long story short, this results in the empties location as seen from the outside of the assembly, relative to the assembly itself, being the world origin within the assembly's collection. So you can always change the empties origin to be wherever you need it to be, and then optionally make it the world origin within the assembly too via the new reset tool. Previously, I created a partial assembly for this part of the finger. You'll notice the rotation and orientation don't align well with the assembly origin, not just in terms of translation but also rotation. And Blender actually doesn't support an instance collection offset affecting rotation. It only supports a location offset. However, in MACHIN3tools Deus Ex, you can now do rotation as well, and it does so by default, which is great. I'll go into the Edit Assembly mode now, also a Deus Ex feature, and align the cursor with the root group empty. Leaving Assembly Edit mode will then ensure the cursor retains its location and orientation relative to the assembly's empty. And now we can of course set the assembly origin from the cursor to achieve perfect alignment, including perfect orientation. Taking a look inside the assembly, now you will find that the contained objects have actually been rotated in a way that aligns them perfectly with the world's axis. It's still not located in the world origin, but we can fix that too via the reset tool. Again, it looks like nothing has happened. But within the assemblies collection, the root group empty now sits exactly in the world's origin. Something else you may notice is that there was a group empty at the bottom of the finger segment's group hierarchy, which served as the cutoff point during the selection-based asset creation process. This group empty, now without any group objects, no longer serves any purpose, at least not as a group. Its location and rotation, however, may still be of use, which is why it was turned into a so-called group anchor. Let's create another partial assembly asset from just the tip of the finger here. And I'll repeat the previous process of moving the assembly origin into the root group within the assemblies collection. Finally, by then moving the cursor into the anchor's location, we can essentially snap the two assemblies together now, just as they were before, while composed of dozens of individual objects. Now they have been reduced to just one assembly object. One per finger segment, that is. You could parent these now, or group them again even, whatever you prefer. Last but not least, let's update the thumbnail for the fingertip as well. It's just too easy, isn't it? If you want to change the assembly origin, you don't have to do it from the side panel anymore. You can now also do it from the cursor and origin pie, and it will say assembly origin now instead of object origin if that is what you have selected. You can even reset the offset from here if there is an offset. If not, it will be grayed out. And as I mentioned previously in Deus Ex, this handles rotation as well. You can set the assembly origin from an object too. Just make sure to select the object first, then the assembly, then run the tool. I'm using the hypercursor beta to snap my cursor on these assemblies, of course. You can do it with the native cursor tool too, but your options are quite a bit more limited there. Very nice. What a cute fellow. Shout out to Rachel. All of these objects have been dropped in from my external library, right? Which means they aren't actually assets in this file. The assets only exist externally. Within this file, they're just mere assemblies, not an asset anymore. If I were to duplicate them and make a change to one, it would be reflected across all others because they all use the same collection. To make a change that only affects one, I can now create an assembly variant in MACHIN3tools Deus Ex. This makes it use a different collection with duplicated objects within. I can go inside, make any kinds of changes, maybe hide the spoon, and it's important to hide it like this, by the way, not like that. Then maybe change the leaf, and finally turn the head a little. Once we leave the assembly edit mode, you can see how the changes really only affected our variant, not the other instances of the initial assembly. And I can do the same here. Create a variant, edit, maybe turn the arm like that. Make him look over in the direction of the other guy. And now these changes are unique only to him. Or her, who knows. Now I can duplicate this if I want to reuse the same variant elsewhere in the scene or file. But if I want to use it in a different file later, I can make it into an asset. And to do this, you shouldn't use the Create Assembly Asset tool, because I would create an unnecessary nested assembly. It would work, but would be rather silly. The Assembly Asset Creation tool is typically for multi-object selections, but since this is just one object, we can simply mark it as an asset and create a thumbnail for it. And you've already guessed it, I've got a tool for that. By default, you can add metadata, including tags here too, or you can skip these by using the Alt modifier key, which will then just create a thumbnail and mark the empty as an asset. And there you go. We can do the same for this guy here, and let's add some metadata this time to see the difference. There it is, with tags and metadata. Let's update the thumbnails too, using the Deus Ex Thumbnail Helper gizmo to better frame things. And you can also do this directly from the modes pie, right? At least in Deus Ex. And as soon as you save this file in your library, you'll have access to these variants from anywhere. So you've created your scene and even made assemblies from some elements for easy reuse. Now you might want to reuse your assemblies in an external file too. You could save the blend to your library location now, or you can run the Clean Non-Assets File tool, accessed from the sidebar, or also available in the Save Pie menu. By doing this, MACHIN3tools will keep only the assets, as well as everything related to them, as well as any fake user data in the blend file. Everything else will be removed. Here are the assembly assets now, their empties and their collections too. The empties, as well as all other user-created asset objects or collections, will all be organized in the outliner. Assets like materials, node groups, or even actions or poses will also be kept, but can't be brought on the view layer, of course. You'll only see them in the asset browser. Additionally, this file contains a number of fake user objects, in this case, decal backup objects. You can keep these if you want, or change your mind and remove them for storage in your library. Up to you. This tool is all about efficient storage. If you keep them, then they'll be available when you disassemble or edit your assemblies later. Save this file to your library location, and all assets in it will be accessible from any other file via the asset browser. Group relationships can now be drawn in the 3D view, toggled either from the sidebar or context menu, but with a group empty active also from the modes pie. You can toggle it to display only the active group, which can be useful in large scenes for performance reasons. You can also draw group relationships to individual group objects. That said, you probably won't toggle group relationship drawing manually often. Instead, MACHIN3tools toggles it automatically for you. For instance, when you enter Group Origin Adjustment mode, here you can change a group's location or rotation without affecting the group objects themselves. Notice that in Origin Adjustment mode, the colors are blue and green. In addition to Origin Adjustment mode, relationship drawing also toggles automatically in Group mode, which is a modified outliner optimized for group management. And here, the colors shift to yellow and red instead. Group mode, toggled via the 1 key by default, is basically just the outliner with very specific settings that ensure you only see group empties and nothing else. Entering this mode will now also change the group selection behavior. For instance, it will disable group auto-select, recursive select, as well as group empty hiding. And in the add-on prefs, you can configure exactly what group mode does and doesn't do now. With these changes, you can reparent an item, like this side of the palm, to another part, and you'll immediately see the change in parenting visualized. It's instantly clear that the relationship has shifted and how. And let's do it for this side of the palm too. When you exit group mode now, everything will return to how it was before. Outliner visibility settings as well as group selection behavior. As you can see, all the objects are back again now. Group mode is super useful, also for just renaming of groups. There's also a new parenting button in the outliner header now, meant to give you a visual indication if the outliner actually does show parented hierarchies at all. I prefer toggling it via the 4 key map, but a visual indication is nice to have, in particular if you show object contents in the outliner, which makes parenting less obvious. Personally, I prefer my outliner not to show object contents these days, just to cut down on visual clutter. However, with object contents shown, you can now immediately tell if parenting is displayed or not. And of course, you can toggle it from here too, without having to dive into the drop-down menu. How group auto-naming with its automatic prefixes and suffixes works has been improved significantly. For example, if you duplicate something in Blender, you'll notice it adds index suffixes to the end of the name. And just by toggling into group mode, you can see that they're all gone now because MACHIN3tools enforces the group suffix instead, while maintaining the group's base name. All the indexes have been moved inside essentially. If I duplicate again, Blender will again add the index suffixes after the group suffixes. And now there are even 2 index suffixes within the names. Instead of toggling group mode, running the Select Group tool will also enforce proper group names and get rid of the index suffixes. Again, there's now only a single index and it's within the name, and followed by the group suffix. Doing this is important because group mode ensures only group empties are displayed. However, if there are other empties in the scene, then these would also be shown. As the outliner has no concept of what a group empty is, it's a MACHIN3tools object type. And so to filter out regular empties in group mode, MACHIN3tools makes use of the group suffix at the end of an object to really ensure only group empties are displayed. There have been 2 changes made to the Select Group tool. By default, it still respects the recursive select setting, just as it always has. This means if recursive is disabled, only the group objects that are direct children are going to be selected. While with recursive select enabled, Select Group will select everything down the entire group hierarchy as far as it goes. You can also always use the Control-Mod key to select down recursively, even if recursive select is disabled on the scene level. The 2 changes I mentioned at the beginning relate to selection behavior while in local view. First and foremost, Select Group will now bring group objects into local view when they are outside of it. And secondly, it will never do a recursive selection even with the scene setting enabled, unless you force it via the Control-Mod key, which then also brings the recursive group objects into local view. But even without the Control-Mod key, you can run the tool repeatedly to select down the hierarchy one step at a time to increasingly bring more objects into local view. And now we've reached the very bottom of the group hierarchy. The Select Hierarchy tool has been completely revamped and now supports severely hidden objects, which are objects hidden due to being in excluded or hidden collections. These objects can't have their visibility state changed directly, and instead must be dealt with differently. The HUD has been improved too, giving you better feedback if there are unselected or hidden children left in the hierarchy, and even suggests what to do if you want to access them. Do note that this is just a quick visual indicator intended to let you know that there actually is something more you can do. Open the Redo panel to get a better overview. In my case, for instance, there are recursive children, and the redo panel tells me exactly what to do to reveal and select everything via the red buttons now. These subsets are visible but remain unselected, because they are children not of the main torso object, but of the Boolean cutters creating the holes. To select them, toggle recursive in the scope section. All the other children left in the hierarchy and still unselected need to be linked, as the red button in the reveals section indicates. That's because they are in the excluded wires collection, which is how Hypercursor has organized them. Furthermore, instead of potentially toggling each individual button, there are quick access buttons to just reveal and select everything below or above in the hierarchy, depending on the direction you are selecting in. Just use the all or all-inclusive buttons accordingly. And as in previous versions, if you are selecting down, you can also reveal and select mod objects, which in context of this tool are all objects referenced by modifiers that are not also in the parent-child hierarchy. The Extrude tools, once activated, now expose the Blender native Extrude menu pop-up key map in the add-on preferences. Note that the Punch It tool itself is not key mapped directly, but you can easily do that yourself, as is explained in the docs. Exposing the native menu key map is intended for those who get confused about how to access the tool, and don't forget that you can also always access it from the sidebar. The tool's modal HUD has been fleshed out some more, and the status bar has been modernized. Oh, and if you don't see this native key map in the add-on prefs, then that is because it's simply not present in your key map, either because you removed it or because you use the industry-compatible key map, which fails to set it. MACHIN3tools will let you know accordingly. Key map it yourself in that case, or again, access Punch It from the sidebar. I made a last-minute change to include the cursor spin and Punch It tools also in the face context menu, so you can easily access them from there via Ctrl+F now. Smart Vert, in Merge Last, and Merge Center modes will now by default merge UVs as well. You can disable this in the redo panel if you don't need it. If you model on already UV geometry, this feature might come in handy. Keep in mind, though, that it won't work in Edge mode. For now at least, this option is only available in Vert mode. Smart Face is one of the oldest tools in MACHIN3tools. It allows you to quickly create faces even from single or two vert selections by predicting where the opposite vertex should be. There's a new topo mode now, which you can disable in the add-on preferences if you don't like it. By default, it's enabled, but only when the retopology overlay is used. So let's check this out and enable retopology mode from the shading pie. You can now position the new vertex instead of just accepting its suggested location. Move it wherever you want it and confirm with the left mouse button or spacebar. Once you finish, the next selection will be done for you, just like in previous versions, so you can immediately re-invoke the tool for the next face. The next selection is also previewed for you while still in topo mode. If topo mode invokes but you don't want to move the corner vertex, you can just cancel via the right mouse button or escape to accept the suggested location. In the add-on preferences, you can also make topo mode trigger based on whether face snapping is enabled or not. I have only vertex snapping enabled now, and so topo mode doesn't invoke. But as soon as I enable face snapping, topo mode comes up and lets me move the vertex. You can then, of course, use snapping by the Control key or invert snapping behavior via Shift tab, just like in the native Translate tool, which is exactly what is running in the background while in topo mode. Also, if you have vertex snapping enabled and also auto merge, then you can snap to a vertex and Blender will merge for you. This object has several modifiers in its stack: a bevel modifier, a displace mod, a solidify mod, a weld mod, and an array using a constant offset instead of relative. It also happens to be scaled down a lot. If you now were to use Blender to apply the scale via Ctrl+A, things will go haywire, because none of the modifier values are compensated. The bevel overshoots, the displace is way too strong, as is the solidify. The weld mod now merges verts it didn't before, and the array offset is also way too big now, so let's undo that. Machine Tools offers an applied transformations tool of its own, but it previously only dealt with bevel modifiers when applying the scale. Now it supports all the other mods you can see in this stack here too. This way you can apply the scale without affecting the results of the mod stack. I'm just repeatedly undoing and applying the scale again now, so you can see how the respective modifier values are adjusted every time for each mod. Also, the tool is now exposed in the native Ctrl+A apply menu, with direct buttons for rotation, scale, or both. For linear arrays, when you apply rotation, the offset vector is also compensated accordingly. You can see the rotation and scale have been applied, and the offset direction has been changed in a way that results in no visible change in the 3D view. Furthermore, if you apply a transformation at the same time to multiple objects within the same hierarchy, it's now done properly from top to bottom, which means everything ends up with a scale of 1 or a rotation of 0 as expected. Finally, while decal backups have been compensated before already, it's now also done for mesh machine stashes. They can then be retrieved in exactly the same relative location with the same relative scale and orientation as they've been in when the stash was originally created. The material picker can now pick materials through wire objects that would previously appear to be in the way. This improvement applies to local view as well, where you might think nothing is blocking the view, but Blender's Scene Raycast would still consider the wire object to be in the way, even if it was outside of local view and invisible to you. Now it works as you would expect, and just as you see things in the viewport. The thread tool now lets you know if your selection is incorrect. For instance, here it looks right, but since I use box select, I only selected the front faces. So instead, make sure to select through, or even better, use loop select. The modes pie has been updated and now includes a sculpt mode button at the top. This allows you to quickly switch to sculpt mode, even in a swiping motion, without needing to find the tiny button in this section. If you don't like this, you can return to the legacy behavior and put the edit mode button at the top again. Personally, I just use the specific edit mode buttons at the bottom and never really use the one at the top, except when going back to object mode, of course. If you want, you can have both buttons at the top even, but note that you can't swipe anymore in this case. You need to click. Now, with group tools enabled, you'll have a few more options. You can actually create groups directly from the modes pie now if you want that, and you set it up like this in the add-on preferences. And when you have a group empty active, all kinds of group settings are available, including group selection behavior, which you'd otherwise access from the sidebar or the context menu. You can adjust the group origin from here, and in Deus Ex you even have direct pose access. You can rename your group and even ungroup from here too. For regular empties, you have basic options, like changing its display type or size. For image empties, you can toggle gizmos or make other changes typically done in the Properties panel. Now this is not new, but with assembly tools enabled and with an assembly object active, you can access a few assembly tools from the modes pie. What is new, however, at least in Deus Ex, is the assembly variant tool and the turn into asset tool, and I've talked about both of them previously already. also assembly editing, of course, also in Deus Ex only, and also explained before. You can choose to disable these edit assembly buttons in the add-on preferences, and then they'll only appear in the sidebar. Now this is actually pretty nice here. You can start with a group object and then select up to select the group it belongs to, or you can select up to leave assembly edit mode. Outside of assembly edit mode then, you could create a new group on top, or select up if it was in a group already, or you can select down to go into assembly mode again. Then even with a group already selected, and in particular if you are in local view or if you have auto select disabled, then you could select down to the next group below in the hierarchy. Let me show you here actually. First select this group, and then select down to make the group under it active. And again, with a group object active, you can select up the group, and with a group empty active, you can select down. I hope that makes sense. The Modes pie in Sculpt mode now has a few more options in the bottom right corner. These include the symmetrize settings and options for DIN-topo and remeshing, everything you otherwise find at the bottom right of the 3D view. So let's enable symmetry on X and sculpt a little. If only it were that easy in the gym, right guys? While the Save Pie had a library reload button for a long time, to reload all linked libraries in a file, the Modes pie now also has one, but that affects only the library of the active object, if that or any of its data is linked. It also features a detailed tooltip that gives you an overview of what exactly is linked, hundreds of objects in this case. For example, if someone else is working on this file and makes changes, like altering the materials perhaps, and let me rematch those decals too really quick. Okay, then save this change in the external file. Back to my other Blender session now. This sweeper assembly is not aware that anything has changed until you reload its library. And there you go. The Save Pie has been updated and will now indicate if there are any unsaved changes in the scene with a star icon next to the 3 save buttons. For instance, if I save this file, the star disappears, but if I make any change, the star reappears again to indicate there are unsaved changes. Additionally, the FBX export apply scale preferences are now exposed directly in the Save Pie itself. Previously, you could only toggle these from the add-on preferences, which could get annoying when you export to both Unity and Unreal Engine, for instance. So now you can toggle it directly from the Pie menu itself. The Save Pie also looks a little different now in the image in UV editor compared to everywhere else. In the image or UV editor, image-related options are exposed at the top of the pie. These options mirror what's available at the bottom here in the image menu. You can select an image from the blend file, remove the active image, load an external file in Blender, save changes to it, and even pack or unpack it. You can also edit the active image in an external editor, if that's set up in your Blender preferences. As soon as you make a change to an image, the star indicator will appear next to these image save operators too, just as it does for the file save operators. Once you save your image changes, the star will disappear. A new snapping preset has been added to the snapping pie. When I take this into edit mode and switch to surface snapping to snap the mesh on the sphere, notice how it moves as if everything is a solid piece, but now you can hit the surface button again to switch into alternative face snapping, which is face nearest. This is useful if you actually want to conform a selection to another object. If you hit the button again, it goes back to regular surface snapping and acts as if the selection is a single block. This also works in object mode, by the way, and will then act on the individual objects accordingly. Furthermore, if you have multiple snapping presets enabled at the same time, notice how the sorting of these presets is now in a very specific order: vertex, edge, surface, and grid, or even volume if enabled. Finally, in the add-on preferences for the snapping pie, you can now disable the fading HUD if you don't like it. See, no more visual confirmation now. Personally, I like to have it enabled, which is why it's the default. Also, the default snapping target for the absolute grid preset has been changed to active now, which is really helpful, especially when you snap multi-object selections, whereas previously using median has led to misalignments. Finally, if you're not a fan of the default snap target and element combinations, you can now customize these in the add-on prefs. You can see that active is used for grid, median for face nearest and surface, and closest for the other two. Also, for volume, it's set to closest to. The shading pie now exposes the retopology toggle, which you may appreciate if you do retopology work in Blender. This entire section has also been reworked and is more contextually aware now, which means it will show only those options that are actually available and make sense to toggle at any time. For example, face orientation is always available in material shading. However, in solid shading, it's only available when backface culling is disabled. In wireframe shading, you need to have overlays enabled, and even then it's only available when X-ray is set to 1, nothing below that. It's actually quite complex. If you look at this object, you'll find that it is still flat shaded, and that is actually how I prefer to work until the final stages of a design. And yes, it's still just a cube under that mod stack. Shout out to Hypercursor, currently available in his 18th pre-release on Patreon. Anyway, if you were to shade this object smooth now, maybe even using the native tool, nothing seems to happen. And that is because the flat shaded curved sections here are actually contributed by the Boolean operand objects. You need to smooth them too if you want the evaluative faces on the active object to shade smooth. You could already do this in previous versions of MACHIN3tools by simply including children or mod objects in the smooth operation, either by holding the Shift or Control mod keys. I tend to do both just to be extra sure everything in the hierarchy down is included. In this case, the Boolean cutters are both children and mod objects at the same time, so it doesn't matter which one I pick, but that may not be the case for you. What's actually new in this version, then, is that severely hidden objects are also included in the smooth or flat shade operations, which are objects in either excluded or hidden collections. And there you go. Now it's smooth. It's still not perfect, of course, because this is a live Boolean mesh, and some issues just need to be resolved on the mesh level once modifiers are applied.